film in which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy in which befell a lone cave diver in the 1920s. In January of 1925, Floyd Collins went off to explore Crystal Cave located in Mammoth Cave Park, which is located in central Kentucky. Floyd actually grew up only a few miles outside of the park and loved to go there every single day to go exploring. And as Floyd grew up, it would seem that exploring the caves was all that he really wanted to do with life. So much so that by the age of 10, he had already dropped out of school for a life solely of cave diving. By the age of 14, Floyd was able to land a private job as a tour guide showing a local geologist around the cave, while in turn the geologist would teach Floyd about the formations inside the cave. In 1917, Floyd actually managed to discover a massive underground canyon, which was covered from top to bottom in beautiful gypsum crystal formations. Floyd thought that this cave would make him and his family lots of money, so he named it Crystal Cave and opened it up for the public. Unfortunately for Floyd though, the cave was in an out-of-the-way area in what was already a rural state. Floyd would try to remedy this by buying a taxi and opting to drive all the tourists himself to the cave. Though being from a rural area, he was not the best driver. A group of local men would even try to strong-arm Floyd out of the rights to the cave, as they tried to get him to try to sign it over. They would even go as far as jumping him and beating him up, or they would try to redirect the tourists that would actually try to come to the cave, even going as far as putting a huge boulder in front of the cave entrance. Floyd then got lucky during one of his explorations when he stumbled upon the entrance to Sand Cave. Located right before all the other major caving attractions, Sand Cave was in the perfect spot for Floyd's new money-making adventure. He would take it as far as dedicating up to 12 hours a day in removing rocks and debris, getting the cave ready for tourists and the public in general. Then the fateful day came. On the morning of January 30th, 1925, Floyd would set off yet again to discover more of the Sand Cave and get it ready for the public. Then, equipped with only a kerosene lamp, Floyd managed to crawl his way all the way down past the turnaround room into a corridor that led into an almost vertical drop. This was exactly what Floyd was looking for, and he was excited. And as he began to make his way down even further, he would notice that his kerosene light would begin to flicker, and so he thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and start heading back towards the entrance. And as he was crawling through the tight corridors, unfortunately, his kerosene lamp would tip over and he would lose all light. Though being the lifelong spelunker that he was cool, calm, and collected. Not to mention he already mapped out this portion of the cave and knew it by memory, so he felt just fine. Though as he was crawling through the cave, he would put his foot on what he thought was the cave wall. Unfortunately for Floyd though, it was a pile of rocks, and as he put his foot on it, it gave way. And within an instant, a large rock came crashing down onto Floyd's ankle, and shooting a horrible sharp pain all through Floyd's body. And even then, he still stayed calm, knowing the dangers that he could be in. He would then try his hardest to get out, but noticed that the rock would only get more wedged in as he tried. He would even try rocking himself back and forth, but with the tight space he was working with, it was not working at all. And it was at this time that Floyd would start feeling a little claustrophobic, as it would turn out that his left arm was pinned underneath his torso, all the meanwhile his entire body and right arm were being pinned underneath the cave ceiling. And all of this while in the pitch dark. Luckily for Floyd though, his head was still positioned underneath the opening of the cave that he had just crawled into. Floyd would then spend the next few hours trying to get out of this position, so much so that his hands would become bloody from clawing at the cave walls. After a few more hours would pass, he would then fall asleep from the exhaustion. When he woke up and realized he was still stuck, that's when his panic really started to set in. And for the next 25 hours, he would go on a cycle of screaming for help and sleeping until eventually his voice would give way. Unfortunately for Floyd though, it was very common for him to go cave exploring for 20, sometimes even 30 hours at a time, meaning no one would be coming for him until the end of his 25-hour ordeal. Not to mention that around this time, Floyd was also living around 3 different households, meaning that it would be even harder for someone to pinpoint exactly where he was. The next day, a young 17-year-old boy named Jules Estes would stumble upon the cave. Jules managed to climb all the way into the turnaround room and was even able to call out to Floyd and get an answer back. Unfortunately though, Jules froze out of fear to go any further and decided to start heading back to tell the others. So one by one, men from the local area would try to go inside the cave to rescue Floyd, but all would come out unsuccessful. Later that day, Floyd's brother Homer would come down from Louisville, Kentucky to see if he would be able to rescue him. Ignoring everyone's plea for him to stay back, Homer went inside anyway and began to climb down. And he was even able to reach his brother. Although upon reaching Floyd, that's when he realized just how hard and difficult it would be to actually extract him out of it. He noticed that if somebody were to head in head first, that they would be working upside down, and if somebody went in feet first, they wouldn't be able to bend over to reach Floyd. He then crawled back out and made sure that Floyd would receive a rationing of coffee and sausages to make sure that he wouldn't starve to death. And he'd head back in with a chisel and start chipping away at any rock that he could possibly get at. Homer would then start to dig out his brother until he couldn't anymore and his hands would start to bleed, and would usually be so weak that he would have to be carried out. For a few hours after that, many more men would still try to reach Floyd, but all would still fail. Fortunately though, by midnight, Homer was ready to go again, headed back inside the cave. He would then work for another 8 hours trying to free the rock that was covering Floyd's chest. Unfortunately though, he made little progress and had to make his way back up top. Upon his return to the top, he would then conversate with the other men on how they would try to find another entrance passageway, as Homer began to get a little frustrated over being the only one able to reach his brother. Also meaning that he was the only one actually feeding Floyd, meaning that whenever he wasn't at the cave and resting, Floyd would have to go starving. On the morning of February 1st, Homer was then greeted by a reporter by the name of William Miller. Undeterred in his mission, when asked about his brother Floyd, Homer just towards the cave and told William that if he wanted the story, that he would have to go down there and talk to Floyd himself. So eager to get his story, and only weighing a mere 117 pounds, William was able to squeeze all the way down and actually have a conversation with Floyd. Although once he got to Floyd, he was covered in mud and exhausted. Once he got there, he called out to Floyd, and Floyd called back, but only in a grunt in recognition. By this time, Homer had removed so much of the rock that William accidentally crawled a little too far in and accidentally landed on Floyd's head. Floyd would then let out a loud scream in pain. But by this time, Floyd was already fading in and out of consciousness from being under the cave for so long. So William took down some mental notes and decided to go ahead and head back towards the entrance. The next morning, on February 2nd, a firefighter by the name of Robert Burton had showed up. He too was also able to reach Floyd, but he also wanted to come up with another plan on how to get him out. His main plan was to put a harness over Floyd and just pull him out, though he said most likely in doing this would tear Floyd's foot completely off. Just wanting to get out of the situation and see sunlight for the first time again, Floyd agreed and said, "Just pull me out of here as fast as you can, please." The man then went back up top to convene with the rest of the men, and to also let them know about the plan. Understandably though, there was an amount of outrage, as losing his foot could easily kill him, and he could easily bleed out on the way out of the cave. Unfortunately though, the men had no other ideas and decided to go ahead and go along with the plan, and decided to send in all 3 men that were previously able to fit in, Homer, William, and Robert. As soon as they were able to reach Floyd, they gave him a handful of sedatives and some whiskey to calm him down. They then strapped the rope around Floyd and began to pull on Homer's go. Immediately though, Floyd began to scream, and it echoed throughout the entire cave. Undeterred though, the men kept pulling. Unfortunately though, Floyd would not move a single inch. So all 3 men decided to head back up top once again. And it was at this time that one of Floyd's childhood friends would finally come into the story, a man by the name of Johnny Gerald. As soon as he got there, Johnny had become disgusted at the spectacle that had become the entrance of the cave. Seeing everyone just standing around drinking instead of actually helping, he pushed his way through and entered the cave entrance. As he made his way down the winding cave shaft, he too was also able to find his way down to Floyd and able to talk to him. Upon hearing his friend, Floyd was ecstatic with joy and for the first time in days actually had a hope of escaping. Though Johnny was a little bit bigger than the rest of the men, and so he had to chisel away a little bit more of the rock to actually get down the final chute. He was then able to chisel away a large portion of the rock that was covering over Floyd's chest, giving him the ability to actually wiggle around for the first time in days. Exhausted, Johnny finally stopped midway. He then gave a promise to his friend Floyd that he would return in the morning to finish the job. The next morning, all 4 men, including Johnny, would then venture back into the cave. Then, with the help of Homer and Johnny, William, the smallest one, was able to reach past Floyd's body and reached his feet. Their plan was then to put a jack stand in between the rock and the cave ceiling in order to jack it up. Unfortunately, they didn't have a big enough jack stand and had to settle for a smaller one and use wooden blocks. They would then struggle for hours, removing blocks, adding blocks, and pumping it up. All the while, at the end, William would eventually succumb to exhaustion and faint. The men would then make Floyd as comfortable as possible by adjusting his pillows and blankets, and then make their way for the entrance once again. The next morning, a man working for the Kentucky Rock and Asphalt Company by the name of Henry Carmichael had appeared to the site. He brought with him 2 workers to help assess the site. As the two men entered, though, they noticed something horribly wrong. As the hot air from the bonfires from outside and the cold cave air were mixing inside the cave, it was also expanding and cracking up the rocks. And as the men were winding down the cave, it was almost appearing to them as though the cave was seeping in and getting smaller as they went further in. Terrified of an actual cave-in, one of the men begged the other one to start heading back towards the top. Though undeterred and really wanting to see what Floyd's condition was looking like, the other one decided to keep going. And by the time that the men were actually able to reach Floyd, the entrance was actually looking like it was closing in by the second. And finally satisfied on actually being able to talk to Floyd himself, the two men were then able to leave the cave safely. The men then had the idea to use a blowtorch to try to cut through the rock. This time, though, as the men were making their way down the cave shaft, they noticed something even more horribly wrong. They were now face to face with rocks instead of a cave hole, meaning that the cave had just now caved in without anyone actually noticing. William would then spend the next few minutes trying to move some of the rocks in front of him, but only for a whole bunch more to fall all over the place. And then on top of that, right behind him, more rocks were starting to fall. Scared to not being trapped himself, he then ran outside. Luckily, escaping with only a bloody nose, William then explained to the rest of the men the situation at hand. And then out of all of the men, Johnny decided to go back inside the cave and tirelessly work for 8 hours trying to remove the rocks, to desperately trying to get back to his friend. And through his efforts, he was able to get close enough to hear Floyd's voice again. Johnny would then let Floyd know of the cave-in, which would then in turn have Floyd bust out in tears. Undeterred though, Johnny kept digging in order to get to his friend. As he was digging, Johnny was able to see some of the light coming through that was around Floyd's neck. Almost on the verge of passing out though, he had to return back to the entrance. Unfortunately though, the next morning Johnny was horrified to see that the light source that was coming through from the pile of rocks was no longer visible, only meaning one thing, that there had been another cave-in. For the next 15 minutes, Johnny just stared at the rock pile, motionless, almost dumbfounded. He then began to scream in anger, and then he would also scream out to Floyd to see if he would call out. Each time, a rock would then hit his head. The second time he yelled out for Floyd, a bigger rock would hit his back. 15 minutes later, he would have to get out of the cave, and we would never return. On February 5th, 142 hours into the ordeal, the state of Kentucky finally took over the rescue. Their plan was to have engineers dig directly on the cave shaft, leading to a better and easier entry to Floyd. It was also then deemed that the men could only use pickaxes and shovels, as the fumes from a machine would almost certainly kill Floyd. And so a volunteer group of no less than 75 men was assembled to tackle the task. The men were then able to get to about 17 feet before their pickaxes and shovels started hitting boulders. And unfortunately, the men still had an incredible 38 feet to dig, which is about the size of a telephone pole. And as the men were digging, their pace would slow down significantly over time. And unfortunately, it would also begin to rain, and that rain over a few days would then turn to snow. And finally, by hour 360, the men finally were able to dig to about 55 feet, which meant Floyd was not far off, and now the men would start digging sideways in order to reach Floyd a lot smoother. And then finally, at 1:30 p.m. on Monday, February 16th, the men finally were able to break through and shine a light towards Floyd. A man named Ed Brenner would be the one to look inside the cave. He would then turn back to the group and let them know that Floyd Collins had passed away. According to the coroner's office, Floyd had actually passed away 3 days prior during the digging of the shaft. State would then deem it too dangerous to extract Floyd's body out of the cave, and he would have to be buried inside. Determined to get his brother's body out of that cave, would then go on for the next 8 months touring and telling the country of his brother's life story. By doing this, he was able to save up enough money to pay a group of men to go and extract his brother's body for him. The men then re-entered the shaft and instead came in through behind Floyd's leg and then were able to free it. Surprisingly, the boulder only weighed around just 27 pounds. And then on April 26, 1925, Floyd's body was then transferred to the Collins family's farm and buried on the hillside overlooking Great Crystal Cave. Unfortunately, his story does not end here. Unknowingly, in 1927, Lee Collins accidentally sold the farm to one of the men who had harassed Floyd only 3 years earlier, a man by the name of Dr. Harry Thomas, who was a dentist and also just happened to be the owner of nearby Mammoth Cave and Hidden River Cave. This despicable man would keep Floyd's body on display in a glass case for many years to come. And unfortunately, sometime in March 1929, his body was actually stolen. Luckily, they didn't get far, and the body was recovered in a field nearby, though sadly his injured leg had been taken. After this terrible act, his body was then lowered into a chained coffin and put into a more secluded area of the cave. The Collins family even protested the display of Floyd's body all the way up until 1961. This would be when Mammoth Cave National Park would buy the cave and thereafter closing it to the public. And at their request in 1989, Floyd's body would then be reexhumed and buried in Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery, still located in Mammoth Cave. Truly now, may Floyd Collins rest in peace. In the comments, let me know what you would have done if you were Floyd, or better yet, one of Floyd's family members. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and turn on the notification bell for more content in the future. Goodbye for now.